Okay, so I've started the recording. I guess we can slowly proceed. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sava Vojnović. I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law, University of Belgrade. And today we have the pleasure and honor of welcoming Professor Catherine Elgin, if I've pronounced that right.
You did?
Thanks, from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who will be our first lecturer within the Belgrade Legal Theory Group spring semester of this year. She's going to talk about the concept of understanding within philosophy of science, or to be more precise, within her book, True Enough, an excellent book, by the way. And she generally has been a researcher within philosophy of science, philosophy of art, and philosophy of education. And besides her book, True Enough, she has written Considered Judgment, Between the Absolute and the Arbitrary, with reference to reference, Reconceptions in Philosophy and Other Arts and Sciences, and last but not least, the upcoming book, Epistemic Ecology, hopefully by the end of the year. So without further ado, I will hand the floor, and thank you once again, Professor, for your kind replies and being with us. You have the next 30 minutes for the presentation.
Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I'm a little intimidated at talking to a bunch of philosophers of law, but we'll get over that. The concern we're talking about today is understanding. And it's an interesting, maybe demoralizing fact about the history of epistemology in the 20th century, that it completely ignored the issue of understanding. Basically, the whole topic was concerned with what's the nature of knowledge. Now, if you thought that knowledge and understanding were pretty much the same thing, that would be fine. Terminological difference, who cares? But actually, there's an important difference, and only recently have epistemologists turned back to thinking more about understanding. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, because it's relatively new, there's a lot of controversy about how things ought to go. And obviously, I've got my own view on it. But we'll begin with a fairly reasonable, widespread distinction, which was drawn, I think, or articulated initially by Jonathan Fonvig, where he distinguishes between propositional understanding and objectual understanding. And this is a distinction that we can see reflected in our grammar. Propositional understanding, you can see if you have an understanding ascription, S understands, ask what follows from that. If you say something that has the form of a proposition, S understands that P is Q, or understands why P is Q, that's propositional understanding. On the other hand, you have objectual understanding, which is understanding of a topic. So Fred understands thermodynamics, or Maria understands mathematical physics. So the object of the understanding is a topic, a field of study, something broader than any individual proposition. Now, that's just a distinction, and we'll get back to why it matters later. But to begin with, I'll just talk about propositional understanding, and in particular, understanding why. So you might say, this is an example from Duncan Pritchard, Anne understands why the house burned down. So what we have here is something with a proposition as the object. And notice a couple of things about this proposition. First of all, it has to be true. Anne can't understand why the house burned down if the house didn't burn down. If the house is still standing there, God knows what's on her mind, but that's not it. If she understands it, then the reason she gives for it must relate to the house burning down. And that raises some questions. So one question is, what kind of reason might there be? And many people think the answer has to be causal. She has to understand the cause of the house burning down. So maybe, again, in Pritchard's example, the house burned down because of faulty wiring. Faulty wiring was, in Aristotelian terms, the efficient cause of the fire that burned the house down. She might also understand it in other terms. So she might understand it in a broader sense, the material cause. The house was a tinderbox whose wiring was never up to code. That's why the house burned down. But in each case, there's a causal connection between the reason she has and the fact in question. And both, actually, we have three things that need to go together. The house has to have burned down, that has to be true. The reason has to be true, and the reason must be the cause of the house burning down. It's not just an arbitrary fact about the house. So we then get a pretty tight connection here. And one question that's quite controversial, and nobody actually has a very good answer to this, is what that relation has to be. The term for it is grasping. She grasps why the house burned down. She doesn't just have some statement of fact. She doesn't just have, some sort of superficial knowledge. She grasps it. So the question is, what do we mean by grasping? And here, I think we get some interesting things going on. First of all, think about the fact that grasping is a metaphor. So we begin with literal grasping. What is it to literally grasp something? Well, it's to hold it in your hand in a way that is both a tight enough grip, but also flexible enough. So if you grasp a hammer or a tennis racket or something, you have to have both a firm grip on it and a certain amount of flexibility. And that is what people think is the basis for the metaphor. So if you metaphorically grasp something, this is what Alison Hills has said, you can control it. You control the relationship between the reasons and what they're reasons for. And that, of course, is very helpful only if we can tell us what we mean by control. And here we get a couple of different answers. One that Alison Hills, okay, first Stephen Grimm will do. Grimm says it's a matter of counterfactuals. So it's not just that you know there was a spark and the house burned down. It's not just a conjunction. There's a causal connection, and the causal connection, he says, is spelled out in terms of counterfactuals. How could things have been different? And reasonably different anyway. So you might say, well, if only that had a fire extinguisher, the house wouldn't have burned down. Or, if only they had made the wiring up to code, the house wouldn't have burned down. But there's some sort of counterfactual in the background. And this works quite well for empirical cases where you're making a causal connection, you analyze the causality in terms of counterfactuals, everybody goes home happy. But there is a problem. And the problem comes from math. Because in a case of mathematics, there aren't any counterfactuals. If I say Pat understands why 17 is a prime number, well, she does. It's divisible only by itself in the number 1. That's not even hard. But there's no counterfactual. You can't ask, what would have been the case if 17 hadn't been prime? Answer, it wouldn't have been 17. There are no counterfactual cases that you can do with mathematics. So we need to, if we're going to say that understanding is broader than just scientific, empirical scientific understanding, we're going to have to go further and we're going to have to ask about something other than counterfactuals. And here again, Alison Hills comes to the rescue, and she says, it's look at nearby cases. So don't just, so if Pat understands why 17 is a prime number, there's no counterfactual, but she can ask, well, what makes it different from 16 and 18? Or 16, 15 and 18, or whatever. So the idea there is you kind of locate it in a broader area, and that will give you the understanding you need. So I think that this is a good step forward because it will accommodate the mathematical case. And we do want to say that there is such a thing as mathematical understanding, and counterfactuals won't get us there. Now, that's fine, but notice what we've got so far. In all of the cases, we've got, we understand why something is the case, why P, and the reason is Q is the reason why P. And P is true and Q is true, and something about grasping how it's located in a given conceptual neighborhood is going to give us what we want. But then we get to something that's even more problematic, which is science. Because when it comes to science, these claims about truth don't actually work. So let's take the following example. Carl understands why helium balloons deflate in the cold because he appeals to Boyle's law. And you know perfectly well from Boyle's law that if the temperature goes down, then the pressure is going to go down. So the balloon's going to deflate. Bad news. Boyle's law is not true. Boyle's law is an idealization that talks about what would be the case for idealized gas molecules that have no dimensions and don't interact with each other. But helium's not like that. On the other hand, it seems like we want to say Carl's got a pretty good idea of what's going on here. We might also point out, by the way, that the balloon doesn't strictly deflate. It's just that the molecules don't vibrate as much, so they don't take up as much space. There are just as many molecules in the cold helium balloon as in the warm helium balloon. Okay, now this suggests that we have to move beyond a commitment to understanding involving only the relation of truths to truths if we want to accommodate how science affords understanding. And we'd better accommodate how science affords understanding. It's going to be really a very bad theory if you say, well, understanding is this lovely thing, science doesn't give us any, because you just can't get away with that. So at that point, we have to move to something else, which is what I have called the understanding must consist of commitments or factual statements that are true enough, which you're going to think is a very sneaky thing to do, very risky. I don't think it's actually all that risky, but it does force us to give up some things that we might have liked. So, for example, a claim can be true enough for some purposes and not for others. So a claim about gas molecules that is justified by appeal to Boyle's law is okay in some contexts, but not in other ones. And you're going to have to say the use of this model is appropriate in this context and not, you can always do this. So I think that's a bullet I have to bite. I just have to say that's true. But it also means, and this is where things get more interesting, I think, we have to back away from the idea that we could just have an understanding of individual matters of fact to ask about how we might have to embed that understanding in a larger structure. There are more commitments in play than might have been the case when we just sort of said, yes, okay, yeah, there you go. there was a short circuit, the house burned down, got that going home. So now we have to turn to objectual understanding. And this is where ideally it's understanding of something I've called a topic or a subject matter. And this, I mean, I tend to talk about this in terms of things like understanding thermodynamics, but you do want to understand that it just means a broad understanding of anything. So you can have a broad understanding of fashion, which would enable you to understand why torn jeans are stylish, something I've never understood, but people do. You could have a broad understanding of football, which would explain, sneaky moves that a particular team is making to make progress. So it can be entirely casual. It needn't even be verbal. So if you have a good auto mechanic who's just really adept at fixing your old rickety car, and he can't explain to you what he's doing, he may still have a very good understanding, which is demonstrated in practice. And that, I think, is very, very important, because we don't want to make this thing too intellectual. I wanted to cover thermodynamics. I'm not denying that. But I also wanted to cover things like the people who really understand football or fashion or bringing up 2-year-olds or anything like that. So it's got to be a pretty capacious notion. And the critical thing is that the understanding is systematic. It is about how things hang together. And it's not restricted as in the description I gave of understanding why the house burned down. It's not restricted to dependence relations. It can simply be associations. So, for example, if we wanted to talk about the understanding that art lovers have of how an effect is achieved in a given painting, it may be a very subtle, complex understanding about how this is related to that is related to the other, that collectively produces this effect. It might be, for example, talking about the brush strokes or the modulations in color, or the juxtaposition of shapes that collectively achieve a certain result. But it's not any kind of nice, strict causal story you're told here. You're saying this is how the whole thing hangs together. Similarly, if you talk in terms of music or in terms of literature, you can explain, how this happens, how that happens, how these things go together. And that's going to give you an understanding of the work as a whole. So we don't want to get too dependent on causality here. Now, it might seem then that what I'm saying here has the unfortunate consequence that pretty much anything constitutes an understanding, because any relationship between A and B might ground an understanding. And I want to say that understanding per se is pretty open, but that doesn't follow that any particular type of understanding is particularly open. So, for example, think about the following easy case. The Goldbach conjecture is that any even number is the sum of two primes. There are untold millions of positive examples of this. You can get your computer to chunk this out until your computer blows up. But it hasn't been proven. So if it were an empirical claim, you would take it to the bank. It's got far more evidence than most empirical things you'd ever want. Mathematicians say, jury's still out. We don't know. We want a proof. Empirical evidence is not the sort of thing we want for the type of understanding we want. So they set specific constraints. And don't want to accept things that don't satisfy these constraints. Or take another example. The window broke. Why did the window break? Two answers. Number one, Billy threw a rock at the window. Number two, glass is fragile. Both true. If you want an understanding of Billy's action, if you want an understanding of something that implicates agency and morality, you want an understanding of the first kind. If you want an understanding that's suitable to material science and will get you through your intro engineering class, you want the second kind. They're both true. They're both relevant, but each one answers to a different set of demands. So when we ask about understanding, we want to, well, what kind of understanding do you want? Do we want to blame Billy, or do we want to talk about the glass? Answer, well, it depends. Now, the suggestion then is that even when we're talking about empirical understanding, things get very complicated. And I think this is right, because one of the things that I would like to throw in that tends to get set aside if we talk only about propositional understanding is that one of the things that you're committed to, or among the things you're committed to when you're talking about understanding of a topic, is the epistemic norms, the standards, the criteria, the sorts of things that count as evidence. So let's take a very, very easy case to begin with, and then we'll see it's not as easy as you thought. Back to the old days when people like Hempel were talking about induction. We have that all ravens are black. Well, what makes you think that? Lots of evidence. How do you get that evidence? Well, first of all, you restrict yourself to observers who can tell the difference between one bird and another. Only those people's inputs will count. You restrict yourself to circumstances where you think the color of a bird can be properly detected. Otherwise, it won't count. You take a variety of evidence so that you go from just birds around here to birds all over the world, being sure to look in different areas where you think the color of a bird might be different if environmental factors led to differences in bird color. So all of these things are implicated in just sort of saying all ravens are black. And if you're wrong about them, then your understanding is going to be skewed or invalid or something like that. It gets worse when we start noticing that, most people don't go around just looking at birds. If you're a scientist, you're going to be going into the lab. And suppose you want to look at, say, water. Well, you don't just take water from the tap or water from a puddle or water from the local river or something. You purify it. And then you do your experiment on pure water. But of course, pure water is not to be found in nature. You had to manufacture it. And then you say, because of what I found with the pure water, I can read it back into the world. So the criteria for reading it back are going to be important. And if you've made a mistake either in the purification or in the reading back, your judgment is going to be skewed. Now, this is all perfectly commonplace. This is like elementary school science. This is not something that takes a lot of work. But then we can get a bit further and start worrying about things like, methods of doing our analysis. Are they reliable? Are they reliable in the circumstances in which we're using them? If you're doing something new, you might not know. For example, you want to test for some factor, but you don't know whether the environment is right for doing the test because the test has never been done in this environment. Okay, this is getting iffy here. Or you might want to ask about whether your measurements are reliable. Well, are they reliable in very cold climates? Are they reliable underwater? Maybe yes, maybe no. And if you don't know that, then your trust in your results is going to be pretty iffy. So in making a judgment about this is how things stand because this is what our experiments have shown, you're taking on board, you're assuming that the methods are good, that the standards are good, that the measurements are not skewed by the circumstances in which they're being done. This, by the way, I mean, I'm talking about natural science here, but the same thing holds in the social sciences. And here's a very good example of this. We have all of these public opinion polls about who's going to win the presidential election in the US, and they scare everybody. But here's one of the problems with the polls. The way they do them is they telephone people who have landlines and ask them who they're going to vote for. Many people, particularly young people, don't have landlines anymore. They only have their mobile phones. Many people, even older people who have landlines, now have caller ID and don't answer the phone when some lunatic calls them up and asks them who they're going to vote for. So you get a very skewed sample now that you didn't get, say, 15 years ago, when pretty much everybody had a landline and pretty much everybody answered the phone when it rang. So you can see that a method that once worked is now much iffier because circumstances changed and it's not nearly as trustworthy. So the thing I'm trying to get at here is a kind of straightforward point, but it's worth taking seriously. Judgments about how things hang together are very interwoven, and they're interwoven in ways that make you vulnerable if the background assumptions aren't correct. So we have to take all of that on board. And we now get to another point that I think is pretty important, which is a question about, I mean, I mentioned earlier when we talked about whatever it was, Boyle's law, that the law isn't true. And if I want to say that understanding has to be grounded in fact, which is one of the things I do want to say, then the question is, how can a scientific understanding that makes use of idealizations and models be grounded in fact? And here's where that iffy statement I made earlier about they have to be true enough comes into play. That is to say, a judgment that's cast in a declarative sentence qualifies as true enough if its divergence from truth doesn't matter for the purposes for which it's used. So saying that the balloon deflated because of PV equals nRT is okay, because the divergence of the behavior of helium molecules from those that would be ascribed to an ideal gas don't matter at the level of precision for the issue in question. And so it may be that the divergence is big, it may be that it's small, but it's basically irrelevant. And that's the critical idea about something being true enough. And one of the things that I want to say here is sometimes the divergence is not merely sort of coping with our inadequacies, but because of the divergence, we can see something that we would otherwise miss. And a very good example of this is Lotka-Volterra model of predator-prey relations, which is basically paired differential equations, which explain how a predator population and a prey population vary in size. So we'll just do foxes and rabbits. The population of rabbits, and the foxes eat the rabbits. And where there are plenty of rabbits, population of foxes increases because good nutrition increases fecundity. Now you have a lot of foxes who are eating the rabbits, and the rabbit population sinks. So the foxes sink too, whereupon the rabbit population rebounds because there are no more foxes eating them, or not enough foxes eating them. So you have this kind of dialectical interplay of foxes and rabbits where one expands, the other shrinks, then that one expands and the other gets bigger. And the fascinating thing about this is that this holds across all sorts of predator-prey relations. It holds not just for foxes and rabbits, it holds for starfish and mollusks. Who knew starfish were predators, but they are, they're just slow. It also holds for loan sharks, who are people who prey on needy borrowers. So the very same pattern holds across all sorts of differences. However, it also is grounded in a whole bunch of simplifying assumptions. It's not true of anything. It represents the predator population as insatiable. The foxes never stop eating. It represents the prey population as immortal unless eaten. So no rabbit dies of anything other than being eaten by a fox. Not true, but true enough so that we can see a pattern that would otherwise be obscured. And this is a powerful thing that the sciences do. Rescind from details that don't matter, enabling us to see patterns that would be unclear if we had all the details in hand. And I think that's a very powerful thing. There's one way science does just an amazing job of giving us access to things by saying, don't worry about that, just leave that aside, then see what would you find. Now, let me just end with one small point about this, because if I've been this generous to say you can discern patterns by just leaving aside things that don't matter, this lets the arts back in the door. Because one of the things you might notice about your encounter with the arts is sometimes if you go to a film or a play or read a novel or a short story or something, you come away thinking you've understood things better. And I want to say that's exactly right. I want to say that the patterns that you found in the fictions may be templates for things that you find in ordinary life. And they enable you to understand things in the way that you wouldn't have understood with all of the confounding details that get in your way in day-to-day behavior. So I want to say that if you really understand the way the sciences afford understanding, you're going to actually also understand the way the arts do. And now I should stop and let us discuss this a bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Now we have 30 minutes or more if needed, of course, for the Q&A part. Anyone who wants to pose a question, give a comment, please feel free to raise your virtual hand and then we can proceed. Okay, so Julieta, and after that I will, okay. She's in the public library, so she'll write the questions. Yeah, I can pinch in. I have a few comments and questions if as Julieta writes them. So thank you very much. I would completely agree with this moderate approach, as you call it, neither skeptical nor looking for certainty, somewhere in between. And I think it definitely makes a lot of sense. I just have a few questions regarding the concept of the concept of understanding. First one would be regarding the relation between, let's call it justified belief and understanding. Would you say there's a difference between the two, and in which sense actually? And the second is, does the concept of true enough amount to approximations in a sense, or would you say there's a stronger difference between the two? And the third, which is actually a crucial question, is, since it's a moderate approach and somewhere in between the two extremes, would you say there is a clear cut on the concept of understanding? Is there a clear threshold, the bottom threshold of the concept of understanding within your view? Because you mentioned a lot of things. You say there are degrees of understanding, which is the advantage that such a concept has over knowledge, let's say, or certainty. So what would you actually say is negligible, or what would be the actuality of the reflective equilibrium? What's if you could go perhaps through an example, maybe the one you haven't mentioned in your initial presentation, just to explicate how the boundaries are actually established. So for example, when I've read the book, an idea came to mind. I think you mentioned Copernicus and Kepler, and their changes within the cosmology views, saying that, of course, Kepler added that the orbit is not circular but elliptical, and then today's contemporary scientific insights tell us that we have to view Earth in the relation to Sun and not just the ecliptical or spherical movements. And I was wondering, would you call, for example, the previous account within cosmology, which is geocentered, I'm of course alluding to the Ptolemaic system, as we know from our perspective now, and different insights given by science afterwards, that it's not correct, it's not true, that Ptolemaic system or that cosmology. But would you call it understanding in that time? Are the relevant epistemic criteria we use when we try to determine whether or not it falls within the concept of understanding, given it at the moment when the theory is postulated? Or does the ex post facto facts and insights tell us somehow retroactively whether or not it was understanding? Because what would happen, for example, if new evidence would tell us that our current understanding of the cosmos is completely false? Would we say that we understood something or not? Because in a sense, even falsehoods help us evolve in the scientific sense.
All right, now, this is the whole rest of my life, but I'll try to say something quickly. Okay, first of all, on the difference between understanding and justified belief, I don't want understanding to be tied to belief, because belief requires, if you believe that P, you believe that P is true. So if you don't believe that P is true, you don't believe it. But I think you can accept P and be right to accept P, and that's what you would do with the idealized models. So knowing perfectly well that there's no such thing as an ideal gas, you embed the ideal gas law in your understanding, and that's exactly what you should do. But that means belief is the wrong unit. It has to be something that's not committed to truth. Approximation, I don't think that that's right for a couple of reasons, but I'll give you the easiest one first. many biological and other accounts appeal to infinite populations. So the Hardy-Weinberg model, for example, talks about the redistribution of alleles in a population, an infinite population, which is very important to the understanding of genetics. Number one, there are no infinite populations. Number two, infinite is not the same as very big, because a very large number is as far from infinity as a small number, and you can prove that. So if you're going to allow the infinite models afford understanding, you can't say that they're approximately true. It's just not what approximation does. In other cases, another good example is Snell's law, which if you had it in school, it was probably the angle of incidence equals the angle of refraction when sunlight goes from air to water. But it's a general law about going from one medium to another. And it's false more than 50% of the time. It's not all that false all that much. And it's not very false for the cases that scientists care about. But if you took any two media randomly and did it, you'd be very likely to get something that's far from the truth. Scientists say, we don't care. We don't actually care if the angle of incidence between, light going through shampoo and light going through gin or beer is weird, because nobody cares about that case. But air to water or, something like that, we do care about. So I don't think approximation is the right unit. I think that if you look at the cases, you find out that there's a lot more variability than we would get with that. Okay, now, one more quick answer to clear geocentrism and clear cases. I think your question is really complicated, because if you have I'll start with the geocentric case. Here's an interesting fact about geocentrism. If you assume if you adopt a model, a geocentric model, you can navigate the oceans because it works perfectly well to treat the Earth as fixed. It's also the case that nomads in the Great Arabian Desert use a Ptolemaic perspective to find their way around, and they get where they're going. So it's not always the case that a geocentric perspective is going to send you completely crazy. It does matter. I mean, it's not the way things are, but it's not that there's nothing to it either. So I think that the question of do they have some understanding? Well, it's not a coincidence that they got there. So they must have been doing something right. And so I think that the question becomes much more interesting when you realize that in some of these models that we now say are radically false, they were still doing something right. And so you'd have to do a lot more parsing to get the correct answer. And by the way, since I said I haven't refuted skepticism, I'm in no position to say that tomorrow they're not going to pull the rug out from under us too and say that one was just as badly wrong as the geocentric folks. And I think that's just the human condition. I think we're stuck with that. Okay, now the
Thank you very
question,
much.
which I don't see, but somebody should read to me.
Yeah, I can read it. So Julieta said, so the first question is purposes, paradigms, or factual contexts. She said, I find your search for a concept of understanding very interesting, and I would like to press you a little regarding the true enough cause. You started saying that a claim can be true enough for some purposes and not to others. And then in the rest of the presentation, you touched upon, seemingly connected to this true enough clause, to purposes, contexts, conceptual networks of propositions, and she thinks some other stuff. And then she says, in this sense, then purposes is only related to goals or aims. That's what she's asking. And in the brackets, she said of the general research or of a single moment in particular. Is it about factual context? Is it about the conceptual networks of propositions that come with, for example, a particular paradigm? And could you say a little bit more about this?
Sure.
Would you like? Okay.
I'll start and you can come back.
Okay.
First of all, I think the account is so general that sometimes your purpose can be perfectly specific. I just want to understand this one phenomenon or this one fact. In other cases, it can be much more general, and there's nothing in the account that favors one over the other. The question is, what are you trying to understand here? Now, you're pointing to something that I didn't say or didn't say specifically enough that's very, very important. And that's, I'm assuming that your purposes are cognitive. That is, you do want to grasp how things are in a given domain. So it's not, I mean, if you're just trying to get some sleep and you're going to read the most boring thing you can come up with, maybe a great idea, but it's not the sort of purpose I had in mind. I think as long as the purposes are cognitive, I'm just trying to grasp how things are vis-a-vis this topic. I'm okay with that. You're right to point out that I have all sorts of other moving parts in this. So it's not just purposes taken in isolation. It's going to be keyed to available methods, resources, and so forth. So I probably would want to say, although I haven't said this, and I probably don't want to say it yet because I don't have enough evidence, but I think one of the questions that you might be concerned, one might be concerned with is this: there are certain purposes you can have only if you have certain resources. So, for example, think about scientific instrumentation. If you don't have an instrument capable of, I don't know, okay, this is Chang's example, measuring temperature. If you don't have a thermometer yet, then here's something you cannot do. One of the things they found with a thermometer, they had a defined freezing point of water, whereupon you can discover that there is such a thing as supercooled water. If you don't have a defined temperature or threshold for water freezing, all you would think you had was very cold water. You wouldn't think there was anything strange, weird, interesting about this. It's just cold water. So even having the purpose of figuring out how come there's such a thing as supercooled water requires the background of certain instrumentation. So you're perfectly right that I've got a whole bunch of other things that are implicated in this, and they have to go together. I think that's just right. Is that enough, or do you want more?
She has a second question connected to this one with regard to the purpose part. She asks, what is the concept of truth that you're considering here? Is it truth by correspondence? And then she asks, is it possible that when you're qualifying with the true enough clause for the purposes of use, you're moving from a truth by correspondence concept to a pragmatic concept of it? Or is it?
Okay. My truth is not. It's a Tarski notion. Snow is white is true if and only if snow is white, and that goes through every sentence in the language. So love is blind is true if and only if love is blind, whatever. And I think truth, that notion of truth, I want to retain because I want to retain the power of classical logic as truth preserving. And only something like Tarski's account can give you that. Pragmatic conception of truth can't. So you're right that I'm moving to something pragmatic, but I'm not moving truth to that. I'm saying let truth stay truth. And then let's look at all of these other things that I call felicitous falsehoods, that although false, are really doing a lot of work for us. So I want to kind of keep truth where it was, but let the rest of the account just start talking about when are falsehoods of various types useful. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think she's satisfied.
All right.
Perhaps I think maybe Goran Davic, Professor Davic raised his hand when I started talking, or
Yes, thank you, Sava. It was good to first of all, it was good to hear that polls in USA about next presidential election are not so good, or are not so correct. It's very good news for us. Thank you for that news. Thank you for your presentation, and I have one specific question concerning social sciences and felicity falsehood in social sciences. 1 century ago, maybe more, one famous sociologist from Germany, Max Weber, established one device, epistemological device, and this device is ideal types.
Yeah.
Do you familiar with this concept?
Yes.
In your book, more of your examples are from natural sciences, and I'm interested to hear you what you can say about this specific concept of ideal types, or maybe broadly about concept of understanding in social sciences, in philosophy. Okay, it's my question. Thank you.
Great. Okay. The issue. Okay. I guess what I want to say is with Weber and ideal types. I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach to talking about the social sciences. I'm not sure he got the types right, but that's a separate question. But saying one way of understanding human beings is to idealize, to make a model of an ideal something or other, ask how that would behave, and then ask how actual members of the kind diverge from the ideal. And I mean, I think we see the residue even of Weber in economics when they talk about, people as rational economic agents. Well, we're not. This is not a true description of us. We don't have well-ordered preferences or something. We're just not like that. But it makes sense up to a point, because the way we diverge from ideal economic rationality, the way you diverge and the way I diverge and the way somebody else diverges, it cancels out in the aggregate. So we can say, and this is why the market is behaving the way it does, because all of the idiosyncrasies cancel out. And I think that what you could see somebody like Weber doing, or hoping to do, is say, if we can figure out what the ideal types are, then we can get what's true in the aggregate by getting these idiosyncrasies to cancel out. And I think that's perfectly fine. He also wanted, and I think that this is also a perfectly fine thing to do, which, I kind of said it a little bit with math and physics, but we can do it with social science versus natural science. In the social sciences, we want our understanding to be in terms of something like human agency. We're not happy if I can just give you the biochemical explanation of this. I mean, it's a lovely biochemical explanation, but you were going to ask what motivated me to do this and not, what neural pathways were activated. And that's perfectly fine too. We say, for this science at this level of description, we want our understanding to be in these terms. And so we circumscribe the domain this way. And I think that's what all the sciences do. I also think that that's what the football fans do. I mean, here's the easy example. Why did our team lose last week? Answer, the other team had a higher score. Now, nobody who's going to ask the question, why did we lose, is going to be happy with that answer, even though the answer is true and conclusive, because they want a different type of understanding. And I think that that's what we want when we want to try to talk about how the science is natural or social, or even how the football fans seek understanding. We ask about what constraints they're putting on the type of understanding they're looking for. And if they're reasonable constraints, then we operate within those constraints. And I think that's exactly what we should be doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more comments, questions from the participants?
No. Okay.
Okay. If not, we're actually right on time. This is the first time that this has happened
Brilliantly
in such a
done.
way. So thank you very much, all of you, all of the participants who have been with us, and especially Professor Elgin, for sharing your thoughts and time with us. It was really a pleasure listening to you, and I hope we'll get the chance to read some of your books in the near future.
Okay, well,
As
I
time
hope the
comes.
next one shows up too. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This was great.
Welcome, welcome. It was our pleasure.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye.